So I watched the most popular Godot tutorials on YouTube, and boy was I surprised. Imagine for a second that you're on YouTube and you're looking up how to make games, because you're a beginner, right? You might find some tutorial with millions upon millions of views. You watch the video, you follow along, and you think you're satisfied with the information that they give you, but what if the advice was useless and you didn't even know it? I did the math, and about 40% of what you've learned from these tutorials have been a massive waste of time. The most popular, most viewed how to make a game Godot tutorials on YouTube have a combined total of tens of millions of views. But is that supposed to mean that they're actually good? As a beginner game dev myself, watching online how to make a game tutorials has been a frustrating experience to say the least. And I wanted to figure out why I felt so unsatisfied when watching them, why I felt like I wasn't actually learning anything. In an attempt to share with you guys this important information, I came up with a list of 3 of the biggest mistakes that all of these tutorials make. What would you say is the most important part of making a game? Something that sort of controls the entire game? If you said coding and code, you'd be exactly right. Point number 1, they don't explain coding. The backbone of all video games. They just gloss past it and expect us to copy paste or expect us to learn from somewhere else. They don't actually care for us to understand even the most basic essential things that are the most important things to understand. People who look up tutorials likely don't know what they're doing. Sure, when I clicked on these how to make a game videos, I learned things like sprite animation and timescale adjustments, but I felt like I learned almost nothing about the absolute fundamentals. Because when I went to make my own projects, even simple concepts, I couldn't do it. The coding always continued to overwhelm me. It's kind of sad to say that the most I've actually learned about coding is through my own trial and error and frustration. Watch any of these videos. I'm not going to call them out by name. They just talk about code and physics and stuff. Not a single one teaches us about how to access node properties or explains the different types of if statements. If you just taught us those things and nothing else, that would be much more actually valuable than 90% of these how to make a game tutorial videos out there. Speaking of value, that leads me to my next point. There's only so far that knowledge can get you when making games. What is arguably even more important than knowing how to make a game? Knowing what game to make. The creative process is so much more valuable as an asset in the game development industry, though these people who make these tutorials don't seem to think so. Point number 2. So not only do they not teach us coding, they don't allow us to learn our own way. These tutorials are probably mostly viewed by solo and indie developers, right? So the audience likely wants us to learn how to do most or all aspects of game development. When they tell us to copy paste code from GitHub or use somebody else's tile sets or use somebody else's sprite sheet or somebody else's music, not only are they leaving out important educational and experience value, they're also unintentionally giving us the vibe that anything we can come up with ourselves just isn't good enough. They're almost subconsciously brainwashing us to think that our ideas aren't up to par with theirs. Oh, a 2D side-scrolling platformer where we play as someone else's cartoon character in someone else's world, and we get collectibles and jump over enemies. Well, not everybody wants to make a game like that. So just give us the fundamentals and let us make the game that we want to make. Point is to teach budding developers what we need to make games. Full stop. That's not limited to coding. That's also for other things like art and music. Don't make us use other people's tile sets and sprite sheets and music and sound effects. Don't make us make somebody else's game in an attempt to teach us how to make games. Give us the basics and allow us to craft the game that we want while we're learning. It'll be much more motivating, much more enjoyable experience. If you've ever heard of the IKEA effect, it's essentially a cognitive bias that explains why we put so much more value and attention towards things that we actually make ourselves. So give us the freedom to do what we want, and we will enjoy the process much more. Which leads me to my next point. Point number 3, if it does not prioritize fundamental beginner concepts, then it should not be marketed as a how to make games tutorial. I know you could have tutorials based on more complex concepts. Well, they're marketed as general game development tutorials, not intermediate development tutorials, not advanced tutorials. Think about it. What person with a fundamental understanding of game development goes and looks for how to make games? Nobody. They don't. The people who need the tutorials the most are the ones who don't actually understand how to make a game. You could argue that, oh, those videos are mostly for people who are just unfamiliar with the engine. I feel like developed devs could figure it out regardless. And even if those videos are for engine migrants, and still, the content of the videos doesn't give nearly as much value. If all you're giving us is fluff and shine, then we're not actually learning how to make games. All you're doing is making us learn how to make games pretty. Learning to actually make actual games is the whole point, which leads me to my final thing. The most popular Godot game development tutorials on YouTube, they're not actually game development tutorials. They're game polish tutorials. Let's get that straight. They don't respect us. They don't respect our time. We might think they do. They might think we do. If they actually cared, their how to make a game tutorials should give us a full comprehensive understanding of the fundamentals. No fluff, no tweening animations or particle effects or parallax backgrounds or dynamic soundtracks or trigonometry or complex physics. Sure, that stuff is cool, but until we actually have the necessary knowledge to actually make games, that information is so very literally so very useless. And a huge portion of time spent in those videos is dedicated to fluff and filler exactly like that. It's almost like they're taking advantage of us, knowing we don't know how to make games. So they don't quite teach us how, just so they can post more tutorial videos and rack up watch time to get that ad revenue. For legal reasons, this is a joke. But think about it. Next time you watch a tutorial, figure out the things that they're trying to teach you that actually have value towards actually making the game that you actually want to make. Learning to defeat an enemy by jumping on its head is such a niche bit of information that not very many people are going to use. Learning to make projectiles with unique physics is not for absolute beginners. Using trigonometry to align objects on a screen in a certain way is not for beginners. Scrolling backgrounds are so unnecessary for beginners. You know what I mean? You know what is necessary for beginners? Coding fundamentals, like arrays, built-in functions, signals, understanding different nodes and game logic, understanding how to think like a game developer, stuff like that. I know some of you are probably triggered about this video, so here's some potential counter arguments that I think I'm going to get in the comment section. If it's not marketed as a coding tutorial, why do you care if they don't teach coding? The goal is to teach us how to make games. If they're just giving us a GitHub link to copy paste, we won't learn nearly as efficiently. The goal is to hammer the knowledge into our brains, the fundamentals, so we can make what we want, not just follow along with whatever tile set preset bullshit you want us to do. And the fundamentals of how to make a game is coding. Sorry to blow your tiny little minds. What's wrong with giving people what they want, even if it seems unnecessary to you? You're doing a disservice to us by not giving us what we need in a way that can be applied to multiple different contexts. Animations and light occlusion are cool, but they have nothing to do with mechanics and solid gameplay. Give us the absolute basics as soon as possible. Don't fluff out a multiple-hour video with random polish. We came to learn to develop actual games, not polished turds. They could apply what I teach them into different contexts if they really tried. Why are you complaining? When you give us a step-by-step, hey, do what I do and you'll have a fully functioning game kind of tutorial, you're not really giving us a whole lot of room to actually think about what it takes to make a game. So give us the freedom to let our minds go wherever they want when we're given some piece of knowledge. Don't force us into watching your interpretation of what a game is based on some asset flip. To recap, not only do these videos not teach hardly anything of value to a beginner, they also make us feel like our ideas aren't good enough. Like we can't have a real game without the bells and whistles, which forces us to look for even more game polish tutorials and shine and fancy features. And that's literally the worst thing to do to teach game development. I'm a beginner and even I know that. I'm not acting like I'm 100% correct. I'm not acting like an authority figure. I'm a beginner myself. I'm just sharing my experience through my opinion. Beginner dev to beginner dev. Popular tutorials are at least 40% fluff. If that's what you want, then sure, it's a good tutorial. If it left a positive mark, then it's a good tutorial. But being surrounded by popular games with a lot of gameplay and beautiful, amazing graphics, or deep, rich storylines, or fun, intricate puzzles, it trains us to think that if our games aren't even a fraction as good as them, then they aren't valid as games, and that we shouldn't even bother. The point is to make games. That's kind of my problem with the rise of indie game culture. Too many people, too much time, way too much money. Their games are too good, essentially, and it sets a sort of subconscious standard. Show people bad games, make bad games, encourage them to make bad games. The goal isn't to be absolutely stunning. The goal is to learn and create and share. We need more bare bones games in the indie scene. Don't show them amazing feats of effort and beautiful Unreal Engine graphics. Show them the x-rays of the project. Here's my final thought. Don't just copy paste code. Don't just go and download everyone's sprite sheets and tile sets. Don't follow these tutorials to a T, or you'll barely learn anything. Use them as general knowledge at best. Look up specific individualized tutorials for specific things, like learning GDScript, or how to make game music, or how to make game art, understanding signals, colliders. Maybe even how to make your own tile sets and sprite sheets. Be introspective. Try to figure out where your struggle areas are, and then do some research. Like, I know nothing about shaders. I still don't understand basic built-in array functions. There's actually much more about development that I don't know at all. There's no shame in having knowledge gaps. Use it to make you better. Look up how to do those things. Because watching these big, huge, generalized tutorials are going to give you very, very little actual value. And the last thing I want is for you to get overwhelmed and frustrated and give up. That is the last thing I want. Surely you have negative experiences with tutorials. Let me know. And if you want to find out what a tutorial with no fluff, filler, or bullshit looks like, watch my tutorial series. Shameful plug. I'll give you the exact basics you need to get you started to make whatever you want. Click here.